Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Sterling Live. I am Caitlin Brower, Sterling social media manager. We come to you week after week, every Tuesday at 1 p.m. Eastern, delivering you some of the best content, thought leadership that we have here. And I'm so excited that this week I am joined by Iain Murray, Vertical Leader Enterprise for Canada. And today we will be talking about Canadian background screening and really giving you a nice overview and telling you what's new for 2021. So, Iain, thank you so much for joining us today. Can you go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. Thanks, Caitlin, and thanks so much for having me on today. I first started with Sterling and in the industry back in 2005, so it's been quite a while, and it was nice to be able to put my degree in criminology to good use. So over those 15 years, I had a lot of varied experience with the company. Serve as a member of the our industry association, the PBSA, the Industry Best Practices Committee, and in my current role, work with a lot of our enterprise accounts on helping them with their screening policy and making the most of their background screening program here.
That's great. And, week after week, we have, tremendous guests. And I know it's going to be a great episode when not only are we sitting down with someone like you, Iain, who's been here for a very long time, so you have a lot of knowledge, but again, we're looking at, a view, a Canadian view of things. So it's our global aspect, one of, the best things we have here at Sterling. So again, our audience, you guys are in for a great show. It's going to be definitely a great episode. So why don't we go ahead and get into things. And for our audience listening live right now, if you do have any questions for Iain or for the topic in general, anything you want us to touch on, go ahead in the comment section across LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook, and go ahead, ask your questions, let us know what you're thinking, everything like that. So I do want to touch, on background screening in Canada, specifically during, COVID, everything that's going on right now. So my question for you is, how is, COVID-19, everything that's going on, how is it impacting background screening in Canada?
Well, that's really a great question, whether you're in Canada or whether you're looking in from abroad. It's certainly impacted our industry a fair bit over the last 10 months, especially on certain industries. I think much like you likely have seen in the US, Caitlin, it's positively impacted hiring in terms of everyone doing home delivery, be it groceries, meals, that sort of thing. And some aspects of retail like grocery and that, but obviously it's hit other areas quite hard. The not-for-profit and volunteer sector, a lot of amateur sports haven't been able to have their seasons, so they haven't had to screen any coaches. It's been quite frustrating. So it really depends on the industry, but hopefully we're going to see a return to normalcy. I think much like the US, there's some renewed optimism with the vaccine making its way throughout the population, maybe a little bit slower than we'd hope, but it's getting there. And, I think we're watching closely how every industry is going to return to normalcy. Are we going to see a surge that exceeds their previous hiring volume to make up for lost time? Or are we going to see that, depending on how far the second wave creeps into this year, are we going to see, certain sporting seasons just sort of abandoned for the year and regrouping for next year? So, like the Olympics in Tokyo, I think were postponed a year. So we had a lot of that with Canadian events as well, and it's going to be very interesting to see. But we're hopeful that those dates will hold, and we'll be able to have some people in the stands to watch these events, and that most organizations can resume hiring as they planned back in January of last year.
Yeah, I'm hoping that I can get back to live sporting events as soon as possible, but definitely looking at the opportunity for organizations to open up hiring again and really ramp up those efforts. Aside from those two, are there any other examples of, kind of like returning to that normalcy, aside from, whether opening up hiring and ramping it up? And then I did love the sporting events example, but anything else come to mind there?
Yeah, specific to our industry, I think we've really seen some changes in the way that orders are being fulfilled. And what I mean by that is, in Canada, the way that education and employment verifications are typically done are would be reaching out to the institution, and obviously a lot of them were closed at various points throughout last year, and potentially again now. And so what we saw with turnaround times for those two services in particular, education and employment verifications, is instead of taking 1 or 2, maybe 3 days, depending on the institution, probably need to add a day or two, as they had reduced staff. So that was one of the downsides. It made fulfilling some of those services a bit difficult throughout the year for those companies that were hiring and looking to verify those details. But on the bright side, we did see some positive change in terms of more people working remotely. We saw some additional services being requested on candidates a bit more regarding ID verification, and that's an area that I'd love to spend a couple of moments on, because that was probably the biggest change as a result of COVID. For those of you listening that are hiring in Canada and running criminal record checks on your applicants, you're likely familiar with the process where you can try to verify their ID online. That works a lot of the time, but per our CMP guidelines, if that was unsuccessful, you'd have to direct people to the local police, maybe to get fingerprinted, to a hiring manager to look at your photo ID, or to a post office to do the same. And so that worked well, but it was getting a bit outdated. We knew that there was better technology out there that could really streamline that process. But I'm not sure that the RCMP had a chance to vet the technology yet. It wasn't written into their policy as of yet. But what we saw as a result of COVID was, I think, increased pressure on finding a solution that allowed for virtually all of these to be done remotely. So, partway throughout the year, I think there was a bit of a relaxation that maybe ID could be verified via, Zoom or a forum like we're speaking on today. Not publicly broadcast, mind you, but at least one-to-one digitally.
No, we don't publicly.
Yeah. But anyway, what we saw towards the end of the year was a bit of a shift in policy that allowed companies like Sterling to leverage the technology that exists, where you can take a picture of yourself with holding up your ID and verify your ID through that technology. And that's really been, I think, an amazing silver lining to COVID, that we all knew that this was possible. And now we've been able to marry the technology with the right stakeholders to roll that out. And I think that's had a very positive impact on the Canadian marketplace for background screening, that they're a lot more accessible than they used to be.
Yeah, no, and obviously we're talking about changes, but some of these changes, were for the better, especially the examples just talking about, right now, and really trying to understand, working, shifting, remotely, but then also the identity verification process remotely, things like that. So it is exciting to see kind of how things did shift, because we really had no other option. We had to look at it from that point. So any other changes? Specifically, we can bring up probably a particularly hot topic right now, if you want to touch on it, pretty briefly, or, kind of whatever you have in store for it. But, social media screening is definitely, popular right now. And, it's just a timely conversation, timely topic, things like that. But it definitely does go into, kind of the changes that we saw as a result of last year, as we are, we're only a couple of weeks into 2021, but we're moving along. The days are going by. So.
Yeah, for sure. And I know, thank you for the reminder. We were just chatting about this a bit before we went live, that something that we've seen, not due to COVID, but as a result of some of the political climate that you're seeing in the US, even in Canada, we've had increased interest from customers already in doing social media screening. One inquiry that I saw was looking to see if their candidates had accounts on Parler, the conservative social media platform. So there's definitely curiosity and sensitivity about that. And so I'm sure we'll be dealing with or handling a lot of inquiries of that nature in the near future.
Yeah, and it's just, again, like a very timely topic for sure, but just for our audience to understand, how much goes into an end-to-end screening program. So it's not always just looking at one area. There are definitely, multiple areas to look into that. So, every episode of Sterling Live, where we can dig deeper into, a lot of these avenues of looking into, from a screening perspective, is definitely important. So I am happy it was only a brief conversation, but again, that is definitely a part of it for sure. Yeah. Sorry, did you have something to add?
No, just that I totally agree. I think that as well as more companies are enabling the work from home models and perhaps looking at that being permanent or at least semi-permanent, I think there's a desire from hiring managers to have a greater sense of knowing everything they can about their applicants, whereas previously perhaps an in-person interview might give them some comfort. Now I think we are seeing an increased interest in even the traditional services like reference interviews, but certainly social media checks are coming up quite a bit as well.
Definitely. All right. So let's dive into, that global look into things. We're going down. We're talking about Canada here. So our audience definitely wants to know, and I am so excited to learn a little bit more about this too. But how does screening differ in Canada from the U.S. and then also just other international regions that we do support? So again, like our audience is definitely going to be interested in this on Sterling Live. So far, we have touched on, the EMEA region, the APAC region, the US, obviously. So it's really, it's interesting and going to be a good answer here from you. I know, Iain, for sure. But yeah, so the difference there. I just put a lot.
No, I'm loving it. Oh, you create such expectations that I'll have a great answer. No, yeah, I tuned in a few weeks ago when you were chatting with a couple of our colleagues, Matt and Melissa and Steve in the UK about a bit about global screening, and I completely agree. I was really curious to see how Matt and Melissa, as the American representatives on that panel, felt about global screening, and I really think they hit the nail on the head. That which is probable of Steve's experience in the UK as well. That in Canada we often work with employers that may have an American head office, and they will often lay out their requirements for background screening, which may not mesh, at least initially, with how things are fulfilled locally. So, when I'm first speaking with customers or potential customers that are bringing their business into Canada or looking at a background screening, and maybe they're already well established but don't have a program, there are a couple of things that really jump out. There was one that I was speaking with a few weeks ago that was trying to do drug screening on sales staff and developers, groups that they're typically hiring for. And there was actually just a recent case here in Canada that I saw through the PBSA come through about drug screening, that it's really not that prevalent of a search in Canada as opposed to the US. This one case and so this one case in particular was showing how there was an incident that occurred in the workplace, and the outcome of the case was that the employer wanted to perform drug and alcohol testing after the incident on the employee, but the courts felt that they did not demonstrate sufficient legal grounds to run the search, that it wasn't a serious enough incident. Basically, they hadn't met any criteria to invade that employee's privacy. And I thought that was actually a really great example, because it is what we see quite a bit up here. I think it does take place for some driving offenses, or pardon me, not offenses, some positions. If you're working in the oil sands, driving trucks, that's probably the one area where we do see it quite often. But for office type work, you don't really see it up here as opposed to some other parts of the world. So, that's one that comes up a lot. One of the others is what I find where the American style of background screening sort of bleeds over into Canada is the idea of doing a social security number trace. So obviously in Canada, the equivalent is a social insurance number. And I will often, when I first speak with with HR teams at companies, they'll share with me, okay, here's what we're told we have to do. And one of the first things that we do when we look over the list is we often see that there's a social insurance number validation there. And I'll often ask, why is it that you need that? Is it to verify that they're eligible to work in Canada, or do you view that as part of the criminal record check? And 9 times out of 10, we will hear that, well, yeah, it's part of the criminal record check. You want to find out where they've lived. And that's a very American way of looking at it. So often, recalibrate that a bit and say, well, that's not really how you find a person's address history here. The comprehensive standard criminal record check that any company like Sterling will, or any local police service will run for you in Canada, will search the entire country. It's a nationwide database, and unlike the US, it is very comprehensive. So you don't have to worry about running that search. So it makes me out to be a little bit of a hero when we have that conversation where we say that's one thing you don't have to worry about. So you can take that one out of the bag. But it often goes the other way as well. There's there's one story that I love sharing that occurred a few years ago, where it was more about how Canadians look at background screening through their typical lens, and when it extends to international checks, it can send them on the wrong path. So there was an instance a few years ago where a sporting group had run a background check on one of their coaches, and so this coach was Canadian, a Canadian citizen, but he was living and working in the U.S. for quite a few years. And they, as I said, they'd applied a Canadian lens to their background check. So if you're not working with a company like Sterling, you'll typically say, go to your local police station, get a criminal record check, and share it with us.
Yeah.
And, although there's some risk of fraud because you're getting a paper-based certificate and just giving that to an applicant, and it's quite easy to Photoshop things, that is still sometimes, unfortunately, the way things are done. This organization asked the candidate to do that. And in Canada, again, it's a comprehensive check, so that would be okay. But in the US, they provided those same instructions. And so what this person had done was went to their local authorities, I think in either New Mexico or Arizona, and obtained a clear certificate and provided that to the employer here in Canada. But someone at that employer, I don't know if they were just smart or lucky, but they had Googled that individual and found all kinds of horrendous news articles about them during their time coaching in the US, where the coach was sexually involved with many of his student athletes. So they were underage, as if it wasn't appropriate to begin with, they were underage as well. And so the sport was really panicking because there was an international tournament that he was supposed to take these athletes on within a couple of weeks, and they were really nervous about him being present on that trip. I think it was going over to China, so it's not like it was just a 1-hour flight. They were going to be, quite isolated. Anyway, it was a really important lesson for that organization because they'd reached out to us and kind of asked, why are we seeing all of these articles online, but when we ran when we told him to get a check, it came back as clear. I don't get it. And we had to educate them that, of course, in the US, as most of your audience knows, a lot of the searches are done at the state or county level. And this person had obtained a check from a county that he'd moved to 5 years ago. All the offenses were committed in an entirely different state. I think it was Texas.
Right.
5 years ago. So they're completely innocent, but their guidance really got them into hot water, or not hot water, but it really got them into trouble because the result of the check came back as clear. They had no idea. Thankfully, they Googled it. They then ran a subsequent search through us that was comprehensive and cast a wider net, caught all of these offenses. And that's a story that I repeat quite often with a lot of sport nonprofits or even corporations that just aren't accustomed to hiring beyond their own borders. And we try to give them an appreciation for how the subtle rules are different. It can really impact the outcome of the searches that you're running.
Yeah, and that truly is a hard-hitting story for sure. I mean, I don't know if you're watching live right now, you probably saw all of my facial expressions, like definitely shocked to hear something like that. But happy to know a company like Sterling can step in and provide the proper guidance so things like that don't happen again. In regards to guidance, though, obviously you and your team were able to support that organization and understand and unfold, kind of everything that went on. Aside from, partnering with a global organization like Sterling, is there any other, advice, best practices you can offer to organizations that are kind of, maybe doing the cross, border, hiring, or just any example like that, just to not to make sure that doesn't happen again, which is what I'm trying to say, like any other best practice or advice you can give?
There's definitely one. I'm glad you asked because there was one other quick story that came to mind, which doesn't involve Sterling directly, but I think it's a good caution that I would offer to any Americans that are watching and looking to screen in Canada. And again, knowing that in the US you want to delve into the county and state level to get the most comprehensive search possible. I do often see as well that a lot of American companies hiring in Canada may default to wanting to run a provincial court search, but they're much like the story I just gave in the US, the shoe can be on the other foot and the same thing can happen here in Canada. So we do see that the province of Quebec, often some companies are doing provincial court searches in Quebec. And one example that comes to mind, quite horrendous, but a real exclamation point on why not to do this is Karla Homolka. And that name may not ring a bell to all the listeners, but it kind of sends chills down people's spines for most Canadians. She was a notorious serial killer with her husband Paul Bernardo about 30 years ago now, maybe quite a while ago. I'm probably dating myself, but anyway, it was a really horrendous, high-profile case, very terrible case. I won't get into the details, but she was convicted of her offenses in Ontario, and upon her release, she was released. She moved into Quebec, changed her name, and if she was applying for a job in Quebec and you ran just a Quebec criminal record search provincially, again, it may come back as clear because there's nothing on record of her committing any offenses in the province of Quebec. And again, most hiring managers in Canada, if they saw, Carla Homolka as the applicant name, they'd probably think, wait a second, I know this name from somewhere. That's not good. But with her new name, you may be none the wiser. And I think obviously, looking at it progressively, you want to allow people the chance to reintegrate into society. But for a very serious offender like that, I think obviously that's something an employer would want to know. And just knowing that there's that gap that, in the case of Ottawa's, minutes from the Quebec border. And I think that's where she may have been convicted. So just to think that if you hop over to the next province that you could avoid the criminal record check. Absolutely, I do not think that a provincial court search is the way to go in Canada. You need to do a national search. So that's one other point I really wanted to highlight for any of our American listeners screening in Canada.
Yeah, no, and thank you for sharing both of those stories for sure. Getting a view into both sides. So I know the first story was kind of, so the first story looked at it from one point of view, and the second story another. So I do appreciate both of those for sure, and I'm sure the audience does as well. So moving into the next area, and this is a part of our overall topic, but looking into the future, looking in, 2021 is here, but there's still parts of the year that are the future. We can still even look beyond 2021 too. So what does the future look like for, background screening in Canada?
Yeah, well, thanks for veering the topic back on the rails away from sex offenders and serial killers. Let's think a little bit more positively, right? There's lots going on. I think, some of the trends that we're seeing for this year, a greater impact from integrations with applicant tracking systems. I think, honestly, what we saw from some companies last year is they may have had budgets allocated to hiring, and those were set in stone. And we did see some companies say to us towards the end of the year, we've been waiting to integrate for a while. We actually have budget this year. Let's spend it before the end of the year so we can hit 2021 running. So we're definitely seeing a lot of interest in integrations. And I would say not just interest in general, but kind of a neat aspect that I think we're seeing a lot of new companies. I don't want to call them startups, but some disruptors that are impacting that space. I know there's some partners that we work with in the sport or nonprofit space, like Interpodia and a few others on the corporate side that are really bringing a lot of value, and I think disrupting that industry where they're making these tailor-made solutions for be it a sport organization or not-for-profit in that case, or a corporation, where I think those organizations are looking to improve the portability of background checks. So putting the result back in the hands of the applicant. And, if they work or volunteer somewhere else, or if they're a member of the gig economy and maybe they're a contractor with many different companies, giving them the result so they can go and share that wherever else they might work or volunteer. So that's one trend that I'm really seeing bubbling up to the surface this year, is a lot of these young, upstart companies with some really nice technology that can bolt into our platform, and perhaps even our client's current ATS, and help deliver those results and make everything more portable and more accessible. Obviously, we touched on ID verification a lot too. I don't know if there's going to be further change this year, given the pace of how things have moved over the last 15 years, but I think just, that change is so recent. The RCMP sort of opening that up just a few short months ago. We're going to continue to see the benefits of that throughout the year. So I think remote hiring will be a lot easier than it's been in the past. That's a big one as well.
Yes, probably listening right now. It's going to be easier.
Yeah, that'll be big for sure. Trying to think what else comes to mind. There is some discussion right now about Canada revising their privacy laws.
Okay.
That's definitely something to watch. I would not be at the top of the list to say that privacy is overly exciting, but I know some of my colleagues love digging into that. So nothing imminent yet to my knowledge, but I know that our industry association is involved in dialogue and kind of keeping apprised on what's going on there to see if there are any changes. But we'll certainly keep our clients aware of those as they develop.
Yeah, well, definitely some exciting things to look for, not only in this year, but further into the future as well. So as we kind of wrap up our conversation today on this episode, I do want to remind our audience, if you do have any last minute questions for Iain, please submit them across Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube in the comment section, and I will hand them over. But as we wait to see if any questions come in, would love to get your final thoughts on Canadian background screening in general in our conversation today, but just any final thoughts from you?
Sure. Well, I think my final thought is in a sense that it's been very interesting over the last year, seeing how companies have adjusted to COVID. I know I was really proud of our company's response back in March, being really proactive and having people work remotely. It was a significant undertaking, I think, but we managed to get everyone set up remotely and securely within a couple of weeks for the most part. And there's been tremendous business continuity there, which I think we're all quite proud of. And I think Canada didn't see too much disruption. As we discussed, criminal record checks, credit checks, those sorts of things were largely unimpacted by COVID. Verifications a little bit, but I am really excited for 2021. I think there'll be a lot of hiring going on, and the background checks are as efficient and timely as ever, and easier to obtain now. So I'm quite excited, and I hope that all of those the listeners that are doing some hiring in Canada this year will feel the same way.
They should be excited for sure, and they should be, very thankful that they popped in to listen to today's episode, because I truly thought it was amazing. Iain, you did a great job with, giving us an overview of the differences between, background screening in Canada, the U.S., other parts of the world, but then also giving us a great look into the future too. So thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and wrap up here. If there are any questions that come in after we are live, we'll be sure to answer them across our corporate platforms. But thank you, Iain, and thank you to our audience for joining us today. This is a reminder that we do go live every Tuesday at 1 p.m. Eastern across Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And we will be keeping all the great conversations going during these episodes in the future. But again, Iain, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a great conversation.
Thanks, Caitlin. You too. It was great to be a part of it.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.